So let's change gears a little bit here, and I'm going to jump into how to start building API access. I'm going to talk about what an API is. I'm going to focus specifically on REST APIs. This is what we're most often seeing customers working with. It's what I've been working with the most in FME, and they're quite widespread and often publicly accessible or easy to connect to. I'll show some examples and key transformers, and I'll go over some best practices for developing API integrations. So what is an API? So API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's really just a method of communicating programmatically with tools and functions that are already predefined and built. They're often part of larger applications or software packages, and you're often communicating with a smaller subset of a much larger system. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. REST APIs send and receive data through HTTP, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's a bunch of jargon, but for our needs, just think of it as a system of URL endpoints and associated requests that interface with an application. So in this example you see on the slide here, my app is the application that I'm interacting with. Integrate is my URL REST endpoint. And my request is get me equals data. So JSON is very often the language of this interchange, and it's what's sent in a request and received in the response. It stands for JavaScript object notation, and it's a lightweight human and computer readable data interchange format, commonly used to transfer data over the web. It's made up of keys, which are kind of like attributes in FME, and values, which are attribute values in FME speak. In the example here, JSON is a key, JavaScript object notation is a value, and data is a key, and 42 is a value. So parsing is a term you might come into contact with quite a bit when you're working with APIs. It's basically breaking down a code or a sentence into usable parts. Basically what we're doing is extracting chunks of these JSON keys and values and translating them into useful bits of information. In FME, we generally do this and extract keys and values into attributes and attribute values. This is achieved with a series of JSON transformers that we have and attribute manipulation transformers like attribute creator, attribute exposer, and aggregator. Those are just a few that you'll run into fairly often. There are lots and lots of APIs out there. In terms of publicly accessible web APIs alone, there are thousands. And it seems like the trend for both web services and traditional software packages is to expose their API via REST. Here we see just two examples of APIs that are pretty close to home. On the left, we have FME Server REST API, and on the right, we have the CityWorks API. This is a look at both of those documentations. They're pretty good and include examples of what kinds of requests to send and what to expect as a response. This is pretty typical for the kind of documentation you'd expect to find with most REST APIs. Okay, great. Let's dive into a little bit of a technical demo here. I'll just switch over to an FME workspace. Cool, so I'll walk you through a couple of sample REST API interactions. The first one here is going to be interacting with the FME Server REST API. One of the most simple calls. I'm just going to poll the FME server with a health check. I basically just want to check if the server is running and if it's okay. So REST API calls are going to have this typical layout. I will have a creator to initiate the stream of data in FME. We'll have an HTTP caller hitting your REST endpoint. And we'll have a series of JSON transformers to parse the response from the server. We'll take a peek at the HTTP caller, and you'll notice my URL endpoint, which is health check. This is a really simple GET method. Pretty much all the parameters in here are default. It's really quick to get started with this kind of call. I'll just highlight that I'm using a web connection here in FME, which is really just a saved named authentication to a web service. And these can be predefined, saved, and they really make using the HTTP caller pretty streamlined. So what we would get out of there is a chunk of JSON with a key, status, and a value, okay. It would be wrapped in curly braces and quotation marks. Basically what the JSON flattener and JSON extractor do is parse that chunk of JSON into what we use in FME, which is usually a feature with attributes and attribute values. My next example is a post HTTP call. This is interacting with an FME server topic. Instead of a GET request, we now have a post. And with a post, we'll send a header, which contains our authentication. This style is token. You might have an OAuth or a different kind of authentication. FME server generally uses a token. And with this post, we'll send a data upload body. And here we'll send our own JSON to FME server. Here it's just key and value. I've thrown this example in just to show how interacting with a REST API can get a little bit more complex depending on the response you get from your application. The US Census API is an API I've got quite a bit of experience working with. It's an open data API. You can basically query planning databases and census databases for state level, tract level, block group level demographic data. Here we see another really simple GET request to the planning database at the tract level. We've got a few query string parameters, which are just querying the database for specific subsets of data. Here I've got county name, state name, total population, and census year. We've got a tract number, and we've got a state and a county. I'll check and see if this one will run properly. There we go. So if we check the JSON response, we'll notice that this is actually a bit more of a complicated response. It's a nested array. But this just goes to show that however complicated your response is, you can always logically work through it with our JSON transformers and come out with a really simple endpoint, which is just one row for King County, Washington, with a total population. All right, let's just dive back here. So I'll go over a few best practices for working with REST APIs. First, consult the documentation. Check what data formats and structures your applications use. What kind of authentication do they use? Is it token-based? Is it OAuth? Something else? Are there any examples included in the documentation? Get started working with those. Next, work out the authentication if needed. Create a token workflow or web connection in FME. Next, start developing using a client. You can use something like Postman, a free web client. You can use a web browser. Chrome DevTools are super helpful in this vein. Or you can use an HTTP caller in FME. Next, inspect the results. View the data from successes and practice parsing with FME transformers. Finally, expand. Once you know the pattern, try other calls or methods. Try to make it repeatable and reusable. You can do this by using published parameters in FME, or try passing in data using attribute values. And if you can, share. Finally, I've got a few useful links for you guys. If you just search on the Knowledge Center for something like FME API, you'll find tons of resources. Here's a few useful links that I found. There's a couple webinars for working with web services and APIs. There's also a super helpful knowledge base article for working with web services and JSON in FME Desktop.